Hiya, Paul. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing very well, Mike. And you?
Yeah, not bad, thank you.
Okay.
Paul, so in our ambition to start looking at more deeply at news and doing our news analysis on current events, we've come across the story that happened on the 31st of August. It's known as the Joburg fire at 80 Albert Street, which was very much a tragedy, and I think over 80 people lost their lives in quite an horrific way. And we've looked at a couple of news stories that have documented this event. And I think out of those stories, we're starting to, or at least I've started to see a theme that has started to come up, that I thought it would be useful for us to talk about, especially with your experience in urban land and housing strategy. And I think you would probably be able to give quite a bit of insight into maybe possibly the root causes of this event, and possibly give some suggestions of how things like this could be prevented. However, it's quite a, looking at the details of the story. It's quite a convoluted thing, especially taking into consideration how far the issues have been let to go, if I can say it like that. I think there's reports of over 1,000 buildings that are in similar states. And I think the issue is, the situation is quite dire. However, let's try and unpack this and see what we find. I'd like to maybe just start with a brief history of this particular building. It's known as the Usindiso building, and in 1954 it was used during the apartheid to enforce the notorious pass laws, and in fact it also played a role in the anti-apartheid movement and the protest against those pass laws. So it has quite a rich history. In fact, it's a heritage building, right? In 2007, it was declared a heritage building, which is also interesting because a heritage building should be looked after. I believe there should be, in fact, a little bit more effort put into a heritage building than any other building. If you want to look at it like that, that's what I would expect to happen in this case. The other interesting thing about this particular building was that in 1994, after the transition, quite soon after the transition, the building was transformed into a shelter for abused and homeless women and children. And so quite a rich history of this building. But in 2019, the building was shut down due to compromised building infrastructure. And eventually the building was left to decay. And in fact, by that time, it had already decayed quite considerably, right, to the point where the building was actually abandoned by the city. So this was a building, a government-owned building that was left to decay. And as events passed, it ended in tragedy, which was obviously quite a sad thing. And it just goes to show the lack of effort, I would say, on all fronts, from officials, government officials, city officials, to find solutions to issues of housing, because this building, or the word hijack is used, and I think that's maybe appropriate. The building was taken over by criminal elements. That were they talk about criminal syndicates that were charging people living in the building rent to live in quite dire conditions, obviously. And then there's talk of criminal activity happening in this particular building, which I'm sure certainly was the case. But Paul, looking at the stories, what has arisen out of the analysis is that there is I would call it a blame game between city officials and NGOs. Now, this is obviously a tragic story, a loss of life, dying in the most horrific ways. And what I'm seeing is no one's taking responsibility for the for the event, and I mean, and understandably, why? Who would want to take responsibility for a tragedy of this scale? So I thought it would be interesting for us to unpack this issue of, I would say, even calling it a fight between the NGOs and the city, because they're both blaming each other. And maybe we can look at the two sides of the coin, so to speak, because the law plays a pivotal role in how these two factions are viewing this event. I don't know if you want to maybe respond to any of that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's actually a very interesting perspective that you've given. My take on this event was to sort of step back and look at some of the historical and contemporary causes, because I think they're like multiple causes that have contributed to this. Now, the historical sort of policy that was put in place at 94, that time period you referred to, was a sort of privatized approach to housing, emphasizing very limited subsidies and emphasizing what they call the user pay principle, and incredibly thinking that you could get bank credit into an owner-occupied home ownership situation, where a lot of previously marginalized people were given ownership of RDP houses, and that somehow this would start a process of wealth generation and self-upliftment. And that's the sort of historical context going back for over the last 20 to 30 years, that this degradation and decay happened in a building clearly where people who couldn't afford anything better were congregating. I don't know the extent to which they were South African citizens or they were migrants. I mean, those are details that I think we will uncover as we follow the story and how it's played out in the news, over the next weeks. But I think what is clear is that there was a lack of affordability by people who go into buildings like this, often under very overcrowded conditions, so they can share the rent for a single apartment, and that ultimately reflects a lack of subsidies and a lack of a committed housing welfare policy by the government. And the precise form that would have to take, the mix between renting and home ownership, those are details we don't have to consider, okay? But there was a hands-off approach from the government, starting with Minister Slovo, notwithstanding the fact that he was General Secretary of the Communist Party in the struggle, but starting with him, there was this belief that privatized housing would actually give people and economic growth and jobs, and government would have to enable it. Now in that situation, if we come more into the present, and as I mentioned in my article, I've got some experience going back to the 90s and early 2000s of working with what's now known as the African Housing Company, or AFCO, in the inner city, mainly around rental, a bit of home ownership. So I'm drawing partly on that experience also. And what I'm seeing in the current situation is a metropolitan government and administration that is fairly limited by the overall budgetary limits, on a welfare housing policy. It also reflects the ideological drive towards liberalized economies, home ownership, privatization. So people like of my ilk who tried to go into local government in the early days after the transition were very frustrated, and I think left. And there wasn't really a place for the ideas that I am saying, call it welfareism if you like. So a lot of the officials who have gone in are people with a different view and who understand this whole privatized view and enabling the market and such things. And they probably feel that they're doing their level best. We know that, and I'm not singling out Johannesburg here, but we know generally in government there are alarming cases of corruption. They don't just they're not just restricted to central government. They are clearly in local government also. It's not beyond reason that there were corrupt officials who were involved with the landlords who took over this building that you mentioned, and that would have been an added incentive to not really do the basic regulation, and we're not even talking about a welfare sort of input that the city could possibly have made. So I think the city and its officials have sort of over many years and decades moved in a process towards that type of management or mismanagement, if you like, of housing. And the watchdogs that have arisen to try and rectify that imbalance have been the non-governmental organizations funded by philanthropists, foundations that are the stated intentions of which are to hold government accountable with civil society. And one of the NGOs that has played a very strong role, and I know some people there, is the Social Economic Rights Institute, or SERI. And they have, I think, taken up the cudgels on behalf of undocumented and maybe documented immigrants who were living in buildings like this, and possibly in that building, I think, to a great extent. And the clash has happened between them and the people on the ground who are suffering, and the city administration and the city officials. And I think there's been this very different mindset. The people on the ground are desperate. They fairly disorganized. They scrambling around often to put together survival income. So they're not highly organized formations, like we saw at the end of the apartheid era. The city officials are in a bureaucracy that runs along a certain set of ideas, as I've mentioned. The NGOs are funded, and they're the most vociferous and visible in the sort of struggle, to get the authorities to do their work and to regulate and to protect the rights of those inhabitants. And the NGOs, and SERI in this case, uses the law, and the law provides a contradictory protection. On the one hand, of the rights to accommodation, and if there is not alternative decent accommodation, people who are illegally occupying a building cannot be summarily removed. They cannot be summarily removed anyhow. There has to be a court order for any removal. That's constitutionally designated. But they cannot be removed even by a court order unless there is alternative accommodation. And that is often used to defend the rights of people who are occupying buildings like these. On the other hand, there's the common law private ownership law that gives a private owner rights to own property and to own, the asset wealth represented in that property, and to do what has to be done in order to protect that asset wealth and generate its growth. And in a case like this, one option for such an owner or set of owners would be to get rid of the people occupying illegally, but they come up against the law on that, particularly the so-called PI Act. On the other hand, and I don't have the facts about the extent to which the building has been hijacked. In other words, it's been taken over not by the inhabitants, but by a criminal syndicate, shall we say, who are becoming slumlords and basically collecting the rent. They clearly they clearly have an asset, and they are clearly valorizing that asset in the situation, and they would not want the people necessarily to be evicted. So, that's how I see, this type of conflict between the city officials and the NGOs playing out, and the law having different meanings to each of these different, I mentioned 4 of them, different stakeholders or role players. It's not a positive developmental situation. It's a very destructive situation. It's destructive of life and of health, and it's destructive of public assets, because these are public buildings, as you mentioned. And how one moves to try and resolve this is another question. But I think moving to resolve it requires starting with an understanding of how we got here. And I try to, I think, reflect on an understanding that's also historical, because I think this idea of quick fixes that just look at the now of the problem are going to keep us mired in the problem.
Yeah, it's interesting that the solutions are so how can I even put it? So almost like they're so distant that the situation of now almost warrants a some sort of solution, but there simply is no solution, right? I mean, just on the point of solution. So the two factions of the city and the NGOs obviously have two different kind of ideologies, some of which you unpacked now. And I'd like to maybe talk a bit about the details there, and maybe some of the practicalities of both sides. So the city is in fact, Kenny Kunene has insinuated that the NGOs are in fact involved in corrupt dealings with the criminal elements. I don't think Siri in their statement has responded to that at all. I don't think he provides any sort of evidence, or apart from just saying that the slumlords work with the NGOs when it comes to issues of litigation. However, Siri in fact has said that they've had no litigation in this building, apart from 2 clients a couple of years ago. But they've had nothing. They've had nothing directly related to this building, which I also thought was interesting, because the city's knives are directed at Siri, right? So when it comes to criminal activity, I mean, if you look at there's some pictures online about that show the inside of this particular building and other buildings similar to it. The conditions are absolutely horrific. The building is in complete disrepair. Obviously a hazard, as it played out to be. Clearly there's a criminal activity going on there. There's probably enough evidence to show that there's undocumented individuals being housed in the building, probably also engaging in criminal activity. And then at the same time, there's probably just people that need a place to stay. So you've got this mix of individuals, and probably a mix of individuals that are just wanting to stay there, some involved in crime, some using it as maybe as a haven to hide out in. There's all of that kind of thing going on. So my understanding, the city solution would be simply just to go in there and clear that place out with force, right? Anyone that's living in there, well, they're on their own. They need to figure it out. Either they go to prison or they get well, I don't know if South Africa engages in any sort of deportation. Maybe they do or not. I'm unaware of it. But the point is, any individuals that are in those buildings need to go. And I think the city also talks about that kind of a strategy they would use to clean up the area, and they use the word uplift the area as well, which is also kind of slightly contradictory in a way. However, practically speaking, that probably would make some sort of a difference to the overall area. However, its knock-on effects could probably be debated. The NGOs come from the point of view of they're merely upholding the laws that protect occupants against unlawful evictions, right? One of the representatives from SERI also said that they consistently try to engage the city to improve the conditions in these shelters, but to no avail. And I think that's also true, just with our experience of dealing with government officials. The amount of stonewalling is quite large, and to get any sort of action out of them is quite difficult, right? So got these two factions going at each other, but with no real actual result, right? And I think to pin a blame is difficult. I would say if I had to pin a blame, I would probably pin it on the city, their responsibility to work with members of the public, NGOs, to kind of find solutions. But it just seems like there's some sort of a stalemate, and nothing's really moving forward to the detriment of people living on the streets. Another interesting point that I saw during the analysis was a lady called Angela Rivers from the JPOMA, yeah, talking saying that criminal syndicates are taking over these buildings, which is probably quite obvious, but that also that they're often supported by criminal officials who turn a blind eye to exchanges for bribes. So which is exacerbating this condition. So if you've got corruption involved here, it's never really going to the situation is never really going to be solved. Because you've got much deeper issues. I mean, just to kind of take a couple of steps back, I'd like to hear what your impression is on this when it comes to a practical solution to let's say the building, and there is some evidence of this, that the building had quite a few undocumented individuals in the building. On a practical level, when it comes to legalities like that, is there under any condition that the city can take a more forceful approach to criminal behavior that doesn't have to be limited by things like the PI Act? Or would the PI Act always have to be a consideration, even when there's obvious criminal activity happening in a situation like that? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think the PI Act is very specifically protects it's called the Prevention of Illegal Eviction
and unlawful occupation.
And unlawful occupation of land. Okay, so the PI Act is really a piece of legislation that was trying to protect both the rights of private property owners and the rights of tenants or people who were occupying or using their property. And it tried to strike a balance between that, okay? And the PI Act is actually very not very strict on what alternative accommodation should constitute. I mean, alternative accommodation could be, the way I understand it, it could be that in theory, it could be that as a landlord, you arrange to purchase a shack for somebody to go and live on some land that might not be what's the word, proclaimed for living on. So you're sort of breaking other regulations there. But the actual structure that you are living in is not a very high standard, not regulated by the courts to be a very high standard of structure for living in. I'm just mentioning that because I think it's part of them trying to find a balance between the rights of the two parties. Okay.
Yeah, but you know, sorry to interrupt you, Paul. But I'm thinking if there is clear criminal activity in the building, which I think my feeling is that it's the criminal activity, the so-called hijacking of a building, that is exacerbating the conditions that people are living in and under. What, you know, and I'm trying to get a practical understanding of under what conditions would criminality be recognized and dealt with, in the sense where force can be used to remove that criminality, so that possibly the PI Act could now start being used, almost clearing out what needs to be cleared out. Because because if you've got syndicates managing a slum rent kind of operation, are those people seen as people that are able to do the NGOs recognize those people as people that have these so-called rights to take over buildings or have rights to tenure there? I mean, do NGOs directly support criminal behavior under the PI Act?
Look, your question is very, very interesting. I think one would have to put that question directly to SERI, but my knowledge, as I say, I know people and someone who still works at SERI. My knowledge would be that they would not work. What does it mean to work with a criminal landlord? I mean, it means you end up talking to that landlord that they. That the tenants, even though the landlord is a criminal, the tenants are not able to pay their rent, and that they have certain rights, and that the landlord cannot legally evict them either and replace them with someone else. Now, if you're going on behalf of your tenant client who's desperate to talk to a criminal landlord who stole the building, is that constituted as working with? I would question that, okay? The other question that comes up is, should a NGO like SERI be campaigning against the criminality of the new landlords, the criminal landlords, and for the rights of the landlord who was the original landlord, the one who legally still has title over the building? Again, these are important questions. I think that question would have to be answered by people in SERI themselves, and it may be something that we want to address to them. The question of the application of the law, if the police, if the law enforcement services, both the SA police services and the law enforcement of the Johannesburg Metropolitan Municipality, were to carry out their duties without fear or favor. Let's just assume that for a moment. Then they would be fully within their right to actually, through a court process, I'm sure, I don't know all the details, to identify undocumented people. But I say through a court process because it would protect the rights of those people. Identify them and decide on investigation whether there is a criminal case against them or not for being in the country undocumented. That's got nothing to do with their rights under PI. And if they were to be detained as part of that process, that's got nothing to do with PI. Okay, that's not a question of evicting them into the open in abrogation of PI. And in the same vein, these law enforcement agencies could be instituting investigations and action against the landlords who have illegally taken the building away from the legal landlords. So all of this, in theory, should and it could happen in the best of all possible worlds. But we're living in what's beginning to feel like the worst of all possible worlds, where there is alleged criminality and collusion between syndicates and law enforcement, and even possibly public representatives. There's alleged collusion between them and NGOs, and it may well be the case that there is. I do believe that evidence needs to be put on the table before these allegations can be taken seriously. But given the situation in the country generally, this is not unlikely, and therefore you can't get this sort of law enforcement happening. And so you're left in a situation of chaos, where about the best thing that some of us can do is to have these discussions about the news and try to understand what has led us here, in a broader public debate, and to try and stimulate that debate in a way that more people, particularly those on the ground who are suffering the most, and the ones who are not in corrupt collusion, can be drawn together, and in their collective wisdom might come up with some more immediate and medium term and dare I say longer term solutions.
Yeah, it's very, I mean, it's definitely it's definitely a dire situation. Look, you can you can be bold and say, throw out solutions that we should just do this or do that. Obviously, these situations are certainly complex, and solutions are certainly difficult to come by, just given all the things that you've said about possible criminal collusions between governments. Because I mean, my feeling would be that if there was a actual will by the city, working in conjunction with NGOs, to rid this building of criminal activity, but at the same time taking care of people that are not actually acting in a criminal way, there certainly must be a way. There certainly must be a way to do that, instead of a building catching fire and killing 80 of those people. There must be a better way to deal with a situation like that. But Paul, thank you for that. Thank you for your time. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure we will have a good couple more on this subject and many others.
Yeah.
Thanks for your time,
Mike. Thank you for making the time also, and thanks for the very illuminating and relevant questions that you posed.
Great. Thanks, Paul. You have a good evening.
You too, eh?